Welcome to the Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we explore the frontiers of technology and discover the remarkable journeys of those shaping our digital future. Today, Marc is joined by Michelle Dennedy, a veteran privacy leader and champion of ethical data use. As Chief Privacy Officer at Sun Microsystems, Oracle, and McAfee, Michelle pushed the boundaries of what it means to build privacy into the fabric of business. Now, as CEO of startup Privacy Code, she's empowering organizations worldwide to operationalize privacy and earn trust through accountable data practices. Join us for a fantastic discussion about Michelle's remarkable journey from patent attorney to globally recognized privacy trailblazer, her experience testifying before Congress, her recent appearance on the Dr. Phil Show, and more. It's time for another adventure of Alice and Bob.
Cool. Michelle, welcome to the Adventures of Alice and Bob podcast. Great to have you here with us today.
Thank you. I'm ready to go on an adventure, Marc. Let's go.
Oh, wow. All right. I'll see if I can live up to it, because I think you've been 25 years or so working in like privacy, data governance, and so forth. Is that right?
It might be a little bit more than that, but yeah, around that era. I've been at this for a super long time. I started last century.
Awesome. And how did that actually start for you? Like what led you on this journey to begin with?
Yeah, so I was a patent litigator starting out at a firm called Fish and Neve in New York City, mostly doing pharmaceutical stuff and not a lot of high tech. And then we had a Palo Alto office. A guy named Ed Maloney was the chair out here, had a case starting, and I was ready to move to the West Coast. This is in the late 90s. And I just took a chance and bought a one-way ticket and moved to Silicon Valley and started out in patent litigation. And in the 1999, halfway through, Sun Microsystems called recruiting for IP lawyers. So I joined Sun, and of course, McNeely infamously had just said, "You have zero privacy, get over it." So as you can imagine, all of the seasoned and important people ran running and flocking towards this thing that the CEO said was garbage. No,
yes.
Not at all.
Yes.
But I did. And I looked at it as a patent litigator would, as a series of ephemeral rights. And there's an element of contract. There's an element of human right. There's an element of property law there. There's definitely intellectual property and tons of blue waters to sail on as far as policy terms. And it's never stopped. So I've been at this for a very long time, but I've never been bored once.
Yeah, I find that's always the interesting thing in security, privacy, and related. It's a great field if you don't like to get bored, because there's always a new challenge, always a new dynamic to it.
Absolutely. And even the old stuff is hard to master. I mean, I bumped into this guy's office in 2000 and said, "Gosh, what are you working on? This looks so cool." And I went home and told my husband, and I said, "Yeah, this guy named Colonel Sanders he looks like Colonel Sanders, and he's doing this stuff." And he goes, "You mean encryption stuff?" He's an engineer. I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Was his name Whit?" I was like, "How did you know that?" A guy named Whitfield Diffie, and I met him in 2000.
Yeah, we have some inspiration to the podcast name with the very old Alice and Bob references. So
exactly.
Yeah, no, that is very cool. And so, I mean, kind of going down this path in your career, like how did it kind of evolve from there into kind of what you're doing today?
Yeah, so it started out, there was no organization. In fact, when I was at law school, there was no privacy class. There was barely an intellectual property licensing class. We had just started getting a little bit of regulation around spam and cookies. So this is really early days. And yet what we were talking about at the turn of last century, and as we went through the first boom and bust of the .com era, was really distributed compute and machine learning and using things, at that time it was cameras and RFID to create algorithms and learning systems and models, some of which were biased and some were not. Sounds a lot like AI, but this was really the primordial steps of compute was evolving from something that you did on your very own home crafted data center to something that you shared as a society, and all of the legal rules needed to catch up with that, the business opportunities and partnership opportunities. And so when I left the legal group in 2002 to become Sun Microsystem's first chief privacy officer, we didn't know what that role was. We didn't even know. They had to promote me 3 clicks above where I was in the hierarchy because they didn't have a senior position it didn't even exist. And so it's really taken me from my career of really looking across that platform, going through the acquisition with Oracle, setting up a security and privacy sales team once I got there, and then going through, I was at McAfee Intel for a while and then recruited into Cisco. And I realized I could build yet another team from scratch, or I can go back to guest lecturing at Carnegie Mellon on privacy engineering, or I could take a leap into Startuplandia, build a platform so that maybe billions of people could learn how to do privacy engineering and build business cases and confront this looming machine learning, which we now are calling AI, but it's bigger than AI. And so that's my goal. So I started privacyco.ai in late 2021.
Very cool. And I definitely want to come back to privacy engineering, but I'm curious for, maybe how you would define it, and also maybe how it's kind of evolved, but like the role of a chief privacy officer, because I think at the Sun timeframe, that would have been like the early 2000s or so, correct? Yeah. And so, I'm just curious, like how do you define it today? And then, maybe for folks, kind of how has it kind of evolved, if at all, kind of over time now?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think it's at its own crossroads right now. So when we first created the role of chief privacy officer, first of all, we called it chief because most of us were women and we didn't have a lot of real authority. And so having chief in front of our name helped us get a seat at the table we hadn't really earned at that point. So it was really a new C-level category. Yeah. And by leaving the legal side of the business, for me, it enabled me to have a different kind of business discussion with our engineering and sales teams and make it really a chief privacy officer as if it was a true C-level executive function. What does that mean for partnerships? What does that mean for profitability? What does that mean for governance overall? And I had a legal support that stayed in the legal group. Now, these days, a good proportion of folks who call themselves chief privacy officers are actually sitting in the general counsel's office, or it's the general counsel themselves. Some of them are real CPOs, what I call a real CPO. They're thinking like a C-level executive, being strategic, worried about what products and services and infrastructure is actually doing. And then there's another group of them that are truly acting as counsel, where they're providing policies, interpreting laws exclusively, and having a firm expectation that business clients, whether that's the CTO, the CISO, or business units, are actually executing. And I tend to lean on a strategic player as, you really have become, if data is the new currency, privacy is her banker. Privacy is the place where you tell the correct story about the correct person in the correct context. So it's not about secrecy. It's not about sequestration or even security. That's an important element. It's not about just making money and selling data. That's an element of it. It's not about public policy exclusively. That's an element. So like so many other chief officers, I really view the leader in privacy as a dynamic role that really is looking across and doing that handshake in that fulcrum and saying, I'm the banker of this data currency, and it's different for every organization. And so you have to be a flexible, really sort of all-purpose utility leader to fill that role correctly.
Yeah, most definitely. And I guess to your point, there's I'm sure differences depending on the company. I mean, if you think about maybe in a very mainstream way, you have even companies like Apple that really try to like market privacy as like a core why you should buy their products and technology and stuff. What do you think are some of the kind of core principles that are maybe, important for this role, or thinking about privacy that is, similar company to company, if there was some things that stayed the same?
Well, I definitely think there is a huge complexity that a legal background helps. I differ from some of my colleagues. I don't think you have to be a lawyer. I happen to have been trained as one, but there's so much complexity that is absolutely inherent to how the legal lingo is written and projected, that it helps. Although I will say the caveat to the ones that say thou shalt be a lawyer, I'm not licensed in 160 different countries where these large companies are doing business. I'm not licensed in 10 different countries. And no, I shouldn't say no one, but I've never met anyone who actually is an active member of the bar in all of these places. So even though I do have an insider track to be able to interpret laws as a common law trained attorney, I think that's one element. So, and it's a common one, and you have to speak the lingo. I think increasingly, if you're doing a good fiduciary job, you're not just buying a vendor and doing a checklist. You're actually looking at what is being achieved. So just like a CFO may not be checking your individual budget and your expenses, you've got the repeatable protocols, you've got the audit, you've got the ear of the board, you've got sort of a fiduciary duty that floats above and beyond any one business unit. I think that's the real common thread, is really privacy is a very active and dynamic place to be right now. That's how we add value rather than becoming really kind of a backwater compliance vehicle.
Makes sense. And you mentioned, given kind of when you were starting in your career and the creation of this type of role as like the chief privacy officer, part of it is, being a woman in technology and I'd say definitely now, but even maybe more so then, although I'd be curious your take on it of like, trying to make headway in this area. Was there any folks that were like an inspiration to you? I mean, in some sense, you probably are the inspiration for a lot of folks, given when you got started. And like, no, I mean, like having to work through all the things that you have at the time frame that you have. Just myself having been around technology and security a while. I mean, that's a very early start on this realm. So I'm curious, was there anybody that you had to kind of look up to, and without a doubt, I mean, you were having to carve your own path, just given the time frame, and again, even to now.
Yeah, I think, and I think this is part of the beautiful thing about privacy and whatever we'll end up calling it, like the chief data officer or whatever we'll call it in the future, of some sort of a data currency officer. I think, I had two very unfair advantages. And one was my dad was a security architect in the 50s. So he started very early in compute. I was raised on a raised floor. I'd go to Standard Oil on the weekends. We were allowed to do corporal punishment in Ohio when I was a kid. And if you shuffle someone's punch cards and they're using a mainframe, you might get taken home and get a paddling because you may have personally screwed up payroll for Standard Oil Company.
Yeah.
I might have resembled that remark. So, I grew up with my dad, and we moved around a lot as a kid because at that time, you basically would get the next company adapted on the mainframe and build out the IT department, then you'd move on. And so like we moved to Corning Glass, and my dad put in the first database from Oracle, and then he very quickly put in the first firewall to protect the first database. So while all that was going on, my mom went to night school when I went to kindergarten for law school and was an intellectual property lawyer. So this blend was part of my extremely geeky upraising. And so, I've been able to meet people, like walking in and asking Whit what he was working on wasn't a mistake. It just was how I was raised. And the same thing. And that was partially also the Sun culture was, if you were curious about something, you just ask the question. People are happy to teach you things. But
that's what I was going to kind of ask you. It seems like you have that very, I find with a lot of folks kind of in our field, just like the curiosity as like just wanting to kind of know how things work, and just the curiosity that kind of like drives you. It seems like that was part of the start, and obviously until now also. So
a lot of us put together, remember when like I got an Apple IIe Plus in the early 80s, and like it came and the chassis was separate from the motherboard, and you had to do some soldering to get it put together and screw the cabinet together. And, so I took a lot of stuff apart and I put a lot of stuff back together, sometimes right. And so I think that level.
I don't think I ever put it back together right.
Yeah, there's always a couple extra pieces. It was right enough, Marc.
Right enough.
I think that's still part of success is, we were calling it big data, then we called it IoT, and now we're calling it AI. And there have been appreciable changes. The LLMs are now better than ever. But, Dragon Softly Speaking was a functional product really, really early on. So we had some voice and we had some IP. So I think if you have this kind of level of curiosity, I think that is an absolute unfair advantage in your favor, because it's never going to be built, whatever privacy and security is. You're just constantly reacting to how I define it as authorized contextual processing of data. That inherently changes because the element of time is constantly causing that organic change. And so that's who you need to become. And so I was very fortunate to have some, in my patent practice, in my early jobs in tech, and a lot of generosity of just people around town and people in our community, like Marty Hellman and Whit Diffie are the most generous, lovely people. And you can just walk in and ask them their craft, and they'll actually teach you and not be nasty about it. And I think that is invaluable.
That is I always find the most important thing to pay forward, because I have very similar examples of folks where it's just there's this known security expert, but approaching him as a teenager or whatever else. And it was just in the same way that they were very curious in their own right? Also very enthusiastic to just share and spread the knowledge, which is I think an important aspect. Maybe to take a little curve. I was told, I didn't get to see it, but you were on Dr. Phil last year talking about privacy and security. I got to ask about that.
I was, and that was another opportunity. Someone in our community was like, "Hey, who's crazy enough to do this?" And 4 people were like, "Her, she'll go."
That's awesome. Yeah. So what was that like? What were you doing on there?
It was great. I mean, it is what it is in terms of mass market. I am very passionate about making sure our message, and I mean our broadly in terms of data and geekdom, gets to the common person. So, in in 2010s, I was doing cyberbullying and teaching about what was actually going on behind the walls of Snapchat when it first came on board. And it was not deleting those photos at the time. I don't know if it will still do that or not. But so Dr. Phil gets 3.2 million viewers a day. So love him or hate him, whatever your opinions are, 3.2 million people could think about what the topic of the day was: implanting tech. So it was some guy wanted to open his Tesla with an implanted thing, but there was, of course, the extreme example of this magician who had implanted magnets in her body, and she had a video of her dead husband implanted in her chest, and it was extreme.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And
then I was supposed to be the dorky talking head. So I played that role pretty well. But, my goal is, if 3.2 million people question what would it mean to implant technology, or even just take your existing supercomputer phone and actually consume it. And let's do that thought experiment of what if, instead of saying it doesn't matter to me, it's someone else's problem, I have nothing to hide, all of those silly excuses that we hear.
Right.
Imagine yourself swallowing your iPhone and everything that it could record and tell about you. And you imagine yourself as part of this fabric of data that's flowing all around us. It changes your perspective on how active you're going to be in protecting your neighbor and your children and asking questions as a consumer. So that's why I went on Dr. Phil, and it makes
that's awesome.
A little bit. I really want to get the message out that this is fun too.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's funny. The few times I've done things with TV, I always get flack from my friends in a good way of, your friends teasing and stuff. But I always find it's important of if you have a chance to get out a good message to a broad group of folks, especially I think, in the field of privacy and related, right? Because this feels like probably I'll probably ask you the every interviewer question on the topic, but you still have so many folks that I think do always have the mindset of like, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. Like, why should I care, etc. And I guess kind of on that question, like what would you tell folks when, we obviously have many listeners that are definitely like kind of in the industry, if you will. And so I think it's, there's more of an evolved thinking there. But we also have plenty of just kind of like, tech enthusiasts
and stuff. Too, of like, we're just and we're like, whatever, that ship has sailed.
Totally. So I'm like, yeah, what does, like, I guess, in whatever broad sense you want to take it, like what does privacy mean to you, and kind of, maybe in the realm of the folks that are like, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, so why should I care?
Yeah, I think it's, again, it helps to do sort of, I mean, this is where shows like Black Mirror and that kind of thing are so important, right? It's like fiction is such a good way for us to experience, the dystopic sides of this thing. Like 1984 is still cited as this important work. And then at the same breath, I'll hear people say, well, that ship has sailed. And I'll give you an example. On my LinkedIn, someone had forwarded me this really well done video that showed an age progression of someone had taken a snapshot of a toddler and then using AI age enhanced, and then had this young lady talking about, having her identity stolen and fake porn and all this stuff. And it was really interesting because I think some people are like, thank you, this is a good educational 10-second video. And then the other contingent were kind of like, this is fear mongering. And then a third contingent, one of whom was an attorney, said that ship has sailed. And I thought, well, I still drive on the road every day and I use my brakes and I now use my seatbelt. That was not the norm when we were kids. I'm older than you are, but there's a huge ad campaign and insurance companies with massive penalties for people that weren't buckling their seatbelts. And it isn't just the largesse of a society to say, I don't care that much about my life. I can go through the windshield. I've lived my time. You're also causing a huge mess and trauma for other people. So if you don't care about yourself enough, I'm sorry, I'm giving you a virtual hug. But our society is now so interwoven. And if we haven't seen the adverse impact on false narratives, on inflammatory speech, on harming individuals with rumor and unfounded fake stories, et cetera, then you're just not awake. So privacy is more than the alarmist arm. And I think privacy too, again, if you look at it as the authorized processing of personal data, the ability to, over time, build up your own value over, people may love me, people might hate me. I have a style. I swear a lot. It's not very ladylike. I'm very outspoken.
I'm down for the swearing.
I'm down for it. It's a good part of our language. It's actually psychologically healing. So people can make up their own minds about my opinion, about who I am. However, I've done the work. So if I have true factual stacks beyond my CV, people understand how to work with me. People have assumptions about how my privacy code platform works because they know how big of a pain in the ass I am about quality. They understand my point of view on privacy as a brand differentiator. So they're probably suspecting I'm thinking about ROI as much as I am some sort of campy notion of compliance. So each one of us, if you compound that exponentially, if everyone is allowed to tell their own story when they want, how they want, to whom they want, it's not a matter of this quote unquote right to be forgotten, which never made sense to me. It's more, how do we interoperate with one another in our stories? Am I a valuable employee that's worthy of a promotion? Am I a valuable teacher that's worthy of listening to? Am I somebody who could mentor your kid? Am I someone to be funded to help make you wealthy? All of these data stories allow decision making in various ways. And sometimes it's just, do I want to be this person's friend, which is, psychological cohesiveness and valuable to community. So I think when you look at privacy in that more broad sense, and particularly if you think about the stories about anyone you love, it's really easy to understand A, why privacy is so hard, because it's so contextual and time bound, and B, why it's so valuable. This is why, like my dad used to say, there's only two kinds of customers that need privacy built into their fabric in their engineering and their processes. The first kind of company has employees and customers. The second kind of customer that needs privacy built into its fabric is a company that wants to have employees or customers. Those are the only kind of customers that need privacy.
Yep. Yep. It's interesting that you mentioned because a lot of times, boil it down to the folks that are focused on privacy or folks that are kind of like, I don't do anything wrong. But there is the interesting, like, kind of third area of it's like where people do know, they do get it, but it's almost like a defeatist, like same thing in security, where it's just like, I always, like, on the security side, I always kind of talk in terms of like, it's this race without a finish line, right? And so it's hard not to have folks that have been doing it a long time to kind of have like a burnt out feeling of it, because it feels like, well, there's always that next threat and next thing and next evolution, and it's been interesting seeing some of privacy under the same kind of lens of folks, where it's just like, we've already lost it, so like why bother or something. And I'm just like, it doesn't have to be that way. And it is just a constant thing that requires effort and work.
It's evolving. I mean, some things that are automated now that we can do to protect ourselves were really hard, and some things that are really easy, like working from home and having a video chat. Yeah. This was really hard at scale. We could not have had the same pandemic in 2000
Absolutely.
As we had in 2020.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's same examples like you were mentioning of, what's happening in kind of AI now, with really more so breakthroughs in machine learning and other stuff that's happening. That's like not necessarily like a new science, right? But the timing for a whole variety of reasons is making it work now versus, I remember being a teenager in the mall where there would be like the virtual reality store, and you're just like, when's that happening? And then it like all went away for like 10, 15 years. And now there's like, the lightweight headset you can throw on to get the same. I mean, it's timing in technology is always very much a thing. But you mentioned at kind of the start this concept of privacy engineering, and I think it's also related to what you do as CEO of Privacy Code. But maybe kind of for folks that might not be familiar, what is privacy engineering?
Yeah, so there's a woman named Anne Kavukian. She was the commissioner in Ontario in the late 90s and through at least the aughties. I don't know when she finally gave up her boots, and now she's a professor. But she really popularized the notion of privacy by design and came up with the 7 principles of privacy. It should be built in and should be consumer-centric, et cetera. That's the public policy goal, and that's what you'll find as of 2010 in Jerusalem, the data commissioners' meetings. There was a unanimous decree that every new law will include privacy by design. And so that's why GDPR has it and all these other laws. The trick is getting that translation from what is that public policy goal that's quite ephemeral. I think we can all sort of agree, don't be evil, hypothetically. Right. But how does that actually break down? How does that become executed? How do you measure quality? How do you repeat that? And so when my dad and I sat down, I'd given a speech at Carnegie Mellon on privacy engineering, really implementing privacy principles throughout systems, taking a systems engineered approach from people, process, and things, and building them across the system. And, we were selling things like the Sunray at the time. If you remember, it was a dummy terminal with a 256-bit encrypted smart key that you'd put in and hot desk, and then we'd protect everything on the back end. And it sounded a lot like time sharing at the time, but it was really quite revolutionary when you thought about an increasingly mobile workforce. So I gave a little talk on this and presented a paper on this. And a publisher came to me and said, you should write a book. And that was kind of the beginning of the Privacy Engineers Manifesto, which I wrote with my business partner, Jonathan Fox, who's still at Cisco. Can't afford him yet, but I will. My dad, and then myself. So Jonathan was an early pioneer in technology licensing, and on the marketing side of things, I was doing more of the legal sides and had taken on this executive role. And then, of course, my dad was the systems guy. And within the Privacy Engineers Manifesto, we had started out writing a book called Privacy Engineering. I'm glad we didn't, because at the same time in Finland, a book was coming out called Privacy Engineering by Ian Oliver, almost exactly at Bell Labs. The same time, that's how we met. Actually, our books came out about the same year, and we were both terrified that we'd see each other. But, calling it a privacy engineer and privacy engineering was sort of a wink between my dad and me, because in civil engineering, they retain this notion of an ethical code. And there still are privacy ethics, but it used to be when you were a PE or a professional engineer, you would sign on to a code of conduct. It still exists. You can see it on IEEE and stuff, but it's really more the civil people. The civil engineers, if your building isn't engineered correctly, people die. The system falls down. If you don't engineer your privacy engineering, it sounds superficial until you realize that data is coming in and out of pacemakers and schools and MRIs. And they're now helping AI-assisted technicians read radiology reports. And sometimes without so much of the radiologist looking at the report, we're getting automated decision-making. So you can see we're having this notion of an ethical element, and then implementing privacy by design using broad engineering principles, not just double E or material science, but that's really where we came up with the notion of calling it a privacy engineer.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's I'm curious as like a follow up and kind of some of the how it gets used in practice, because I was thinking in terms of like, in maybe the broader like information security space, right? There's the difference of I don't know if this will be a good parallel, but there's a difference of like companies where they're doing security in terms of where, you buy a handful of products and you kind of implement them versus like you're doing security engineering, right?
Yes.
And there's like a definite distinction, and it makes me think similar where I definitely with companies where, maybe you're checking the right boxes from kind of like a regulatory privacy, but are you really like engineering in privacy in the way that you're talking? It seems like a definite distinction.
Well, and there's even a further schism since we first started talking about it. There's a whole variety of sort of what I call privacy engineering purists that consider if you're not a mathematician, then you can't possibly be a privacy engineer. I completely reject that notion, of course, but there is a very specialized notion of privacy engineering that really is more focused around anonymity and mathematical obscurity of personalized data, which is important. But I don't think that spans, when I think of an engineer and what engineers were, they look at the tools and materials around them. They look at, is this a creek that I'm covering with a bridge, or is this the Golden Gate Bridge? And that determines what materials you use. And like you said, sometimes you can sort of train your way around privacy and say, be careful, kids, because you're not collecting data. And some people
just don't click on links and you're fine.
Don't click on links. It's fine. They'll never be phishing. Social engineering is not a thing.
It's not a thing.
Or you can actually really dig in and go, hey, you know what? Some of our personal assets here, some of our employees are really hard to replace and they're expensive. We should at least protect the HR data, maybe. Some of our, like when we actually close our books and we report to our public board, we have a fiduciary obligation to kind of get that right. So you can take SOX and that's fine, but there's always a who. And you can think that intellectual property, I hear this a lot from CISOs. Oh, well, I don't really do the privacy part. I do the IP part. Well, I'm a former IP litigator. So you can crap on me all you want that I'm not a double E. But when you say to me IP, I'm going to go, what IP? Or is it this recipe to the routers that's the most valuable thing? Or is it not the behavior of everyone on all of the routers around the world that's the important thing right now? And I'm going to go for door number 2.
Yeah.
So, and if you're just looking to, and I say just because it's hard, if you're just looking to be in compliance, maybe you are just trying to obscure that or make it quote unquote anonymous. And I think the whole Google ad tech experiment, they crested that and sort of have landed this in not a very comfortable way where they said, we'll just make everything anonymous. And it's just about differential privacy or statistical relevant, like some, weirdly, old lady 2 kids, person who does privacy law in Los Altos. That's who we're going to market the ad to. Now, that's me. And there's like, I'm a pretty weird cat and I'm pretty unique, but it could be a couple similar people to me. I think A, the regulators are onto us. B, with the weight and the volume and the size, whether we should or should not be doing this much compute to come up with common sense answers to common sense questions. Anonymity has always been hard to achieve. And in the advent of these language models that are becoming really organic and fourth dimensional with our voices and our faces and our blood types and our DNA, I think we're going to start to go back. It's a long-winded answer to your question, Mark, but no, I think that's why privacy engineering is still evolving even. And there's a fight within us. And this is, again, why I go on Dr. Phil, because I'm like, forget the infighting, kids. This world is too big and there's too much of it for us to protect, to be like, you just do this and I just do this. And there's, we'll just pretend that we work together. No, you actually have to like do a rugby huddle here.
100%. No. And it's interesting to me too, of like, I think when I got started in security in like the late 90s, early 2000 timeframe, and like, there was the type of security, I guess I was doing then, if like, vulnerability threat research type of stuff, you could kind of know all of it. And now there's like all these different specializations of like, you're doing malware or network or this or that. And it's, I guess, really interesting too, in your world of like, especially for folks that are maybe listening that, are kind of, newer or looking for a path into this world in general of like, exactly what you're bringing up of like privacy engineering and it's probably a myriad of different, types and roles. But, I like the part that you were making of, even though there maybe are these different areas of specialty, it's really the intersection of like how everything comes together that matters. And we're like forever trying to break down silos in so many ways.
In so many, and sometimes just breaking into stuff and still breaking things apart and hoping that the extra screw wasn't that important. But sure. This is a great example too, because privacy is, probably 20 years behind where security is, even though it really was the California privacy law that like created $1 trillion of security wealth, because after you had to disclose the breach and we had that little safe harbor there to encrypt it, you could kind of get out of the breach for a little while there. That just spawned this huge thing. People forget that's a privacy law. But we'll leave that jealousness aside. But now going into it, privacy is really still behind. And so you do see some people saying, oh, let's do static analysis, or let's start with a data map. And I'm kind of like, I like static analysis where I've laid down the rules. So if I've already done the work, I've done data modeling and I've laid down the architecture and I know what rules are supposed to be there, maybe you could scan for some patterns, but it's not the same as looking for Stack Overflow or DDoS attack. It's different. We don't have that much track record behind us. The other part is, if you've got a great security team, I'm going to assume that you can tell me something about what kind of apps that we have and how you're protecting the IO there. I'm going to assume that you've at least thought through what our risk profile is and the shape at least of the IT footprint. So as a privacy person, often living in the general counsel's office and often with not a ton of software buying experience, if you're not talking to your technical classmates, you're doing your job wrong.
Yeah.
A lot of that wisdom, it may not be applied to privacy data, and it's probably not, but the wisdom of the shape of things and the owner, and big air quotes, of who's actually creating risk, generating data, deleting data. Are we deleting data ever? Do we still think that more is more, and a big pile of pony dung equals ponies and not cholera?
Totally. No, and it's it's like the I don't know, all these different like organizational silos that tend to exist, and but they they exist at really like the detriment to most companies, in the sense that like for attackers and everybody else, when we're thinking in terms of security and theft and everything, like none of those silos exist like for them. And it's really more of in some cases what kind of enables these outcomes.
You never would say that to the CFO. Like, I'm sorry. You just stay over there and count your beans. I'm just going to do whatever I want over here. No, you're going to assume he knows more about money or she knows more about money than you do.
Yeah. Yeah. I have no good segue, but I wanted to also ask, because I thought it was an interesting note that they mentioned to me. But you were basically like, there was like a character reference to in The Usual Suspects, which the reason I wanted to like totally no segue ask you is because I love that movie, found it to be an amazing movie. And I heard there's an interesting story there. Sorry, I'm just bringing it up out of the blue because I love the movie. Great. And I was like, how did that actually happen?
It's actually great because I've actually sent a few DMs to Chris McQuarrie, who's the author of that movie. I'm like, dude, why are you not financing my company? You're richer than God. And you see him all the time. So the white-haired, kind of bearded, goateed guy that's always hanging around Tom Cruise now and all his like stuff, that's Chris McQuarrie. So Chris and I were high school sweethearts, and we went to senior prom together. And he was class clown. I was new because I was always new. We were always moving when I was a kid. And we used to go down to the Jersey Shore in my white, on the outside, blue Naga hide interior Ford Champ. And we would write in this thing he called the Book of Ideas. And there's a guy who killed his entire family in New Jersey, John List. And so The Usual Suspects began as an exploration of what if you had done something so horrible, and then you just like walked away from your life, which is what this real life character did. So everybody in the movie, so my maiden name is Finneran, and I was in law school when Suspects was shot. They had already won the Sundance Film Festival. So this is the 2 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So Kevin Bacon did Footloose with Laurie Singer. Laurie Singer's cousin was a gentleman named Brian Singer, who's been in a lot of hot water lately. He didn't do anything naughty when I knew him, but he and Ethan Hawke and Chris were friends at my high school. And Ethan had gone on to do Goonies and all this other, handsome, beautiful chin type work.
Another must watch.
So he went off to go be famous. But it all kind of started with Brian getting into the business and having that entree into the business because of Laurie Singer and Kevin Bacon. Kevin Bacon making his big thing because Keira Sedgwick is the daughter of a billionaire. So it all comes down to money. So Chris writes this movie, and everybody in The Usual Suspects is like someone that I know. So like all the names are people like who Chris either worked with when he was he was a security guard in Australia for a while. He worked at a boys' school. He was a big cut up. And it's funny that he's made millions and millions as a writer now because he graduated high school with a D- from our English teacher, a guy named Mr. Barris, who was wonderful. And so Edie Finneran was the lawyer. And at the time I was dyeing my hair blonde. So Susie and me was supposed to be a close approximation in the movie.
Love it. I love it. And I heard you have some aspirations for your own writing that might have spawned from a legal case that you discovered a warehouse. Yeah. I mean, you have I want to keep asking you privacy, but you have some really other interesting, I could go on and on. But yeah.
Why? Because we get into mayhem, Mark. That's why we get into.
I'm just saying. I might bust a beer out midday. And, but yeah, a warehouse full of body parts. How does that fit into legal privacy, et cetera, background?
Yeah. So I was a patent litigator. And what that means when you're right out of school, especially when you're a woman in the 90s for a New York firm, is like you're still wearing mandatory pantyhose and blue polyester suits. So, and skirts. We weren't allowed to wear pants to work still. I mean, it's crazy. I'm not that old. We were not. I was actually sent home from work for wearing a double-breasted blazer and pantsuit combination because I
just getting too crazy. Just too crazy.
Wild. No one really needs to see my knees then or now. So I was sent down to a warehouse to do document retrieval for a pharmaceutical company for a patent case. And basically, you're looking for the oldest reduction to practice of that invention. So you're going through all these banker boxes on these big wooden pallets. It's out in the middle of the desert in Southern California. And all of a sudden, this guy, Robert, who I was working with, who happened to be a former he had an MD/JD. He was a coroner or one of their assistants. I don't know what the official title was, but he'd worked in like the morgue before he went to law school. So he's like, you got to look at this. And so we opened these boxes, and they're in these jars of formaldehyde. It was like a human heart and a human hand. And we started digging through these files, and this lab that we were representing had acquired another lab that had done work for the LA Sheriff's Department in the 1960s. And so there were boxes and boxes and boxes from all of the public lynchings that you really don't hear about from LA. What? You hear about the Deep South. There were a lot of public lynchings and all sorts of civil rights crimes and murders. And all of this evidence had been collected and not processed and hiding out in this warehouse in the 90s that we discovered and we reported. And so the end of the real story is we reported, and the sheriff's office took custody, and hopefully some of these people got justice later in life because DNA.
Yeah.
But that was kind of like, that's my fantasy beginning of a novel of, imagine going through and finding the real cover up, because you really didn't hear a lot about this going on in this part of the country. There's kind of the spin of the stories, again, stories that we tell about ourselves and when and what's true and what's not. There's been a spin on this from day one since, Fred came out of his cave and knocked Ned on the noggin with his what a crazy story, but it seems, now more than ever, like there's just where technology is at, and kind of, I think about it for like, my kids growing up in a world in which like it's going to be ever harder to kind of, discern, reality from not, given kind of what technology is allowing to enable, and also just the reality, or there's reality too many times, but also just the fact that like, the virtual reality, and, kind of virtual currencies, everything else. And in some sense, currency has always been virtual, I guess. Yep. It's not really been real. It's just all these shared beliefs we have. Right. But now the shared beliefs that we have that kind of make up society can be, falsified with pretty amazing realness, I guess. And like, I guess when you think kind of going forward, is there any kind of like, main things that you think about that, whether in the realm of privacy or technology, just in general, right? With just the kind of state of where we're at, and the, the ability to kind of, put forth things that are untrue, whether audio, video, and more. What do you think? How do you think that unfolds? Yeah, it's a big question, but I think it's a really important one. I think especially when we start to feel, like this one attorney who I didn't know, wasn't even connected with me, just felt like he needed to inform me that, this AI paradigm and the downsides of, recording your kids. And I'm a terrible oversharer. I love my kids. So I gave them code names of Sweet Cheeks and Ms. Thang, but beyond that, like their faces are everywhere. But he decided that AI ship has sailed. He was like a trust and estates lawyer. I was like, why do you have an opinion about this? And why are you being rude? So what are the manners online? So why can some senior attorney from a totally different field feel empowered to, is this free speech or is this just you being an ass? I think it feels like the latter. It didn't add anything to the discussion except to reveal that there are educated people that have uneducated points of view on things that they know nothing about. I think the other thing that's interesting is when I think about particularly my younger daughter, who's much more, both my daughters are beautiful. One is more glamorous than the other and much more like wants spangles on everything. We will have like 100 years from now, it will be probably just as hard to discern what I looked like from the one or two Polaroids that existed from my childhood and what she actually looks like out of the millions of self photos that she's taken and has exchanged like every 10 minutes on someone's story. That's just, they just take a picture of their face. And so I think it will be as hard to tell what she actually looks like as it is me, because there's such a scarcity of data and there's so much data that's been manipulated in a million different ways in her case. But it's a very different experience. You know, in my mind's eye, can be as glamorous. I was not. I actually had somebody said to me, I can't remember what the context was anymore, but they just said, "Oh, Michelle's like some sort of faded prom queen." And I called home to my dad. It was some, executive man who was being rude to me. And I was like, he called me a faded prom queen. And of course, my dad being very crunchy engineer type, he's like, "Oh, darling, you were never a prom queen." I was like, that's your takeaway, man?
You're like, okay.
But I want to be as fantastical in my memory as I want to be. And that's freedom. And yet our daughters and sons, they are as fictitiously curated now in real time. So I think how we decide what our culture looks like, what it looks like to have a universal culture, because despite all of this connectivity and all these stories that we can prove and tell and have real data, we still have people who will instinctually tell you they just don't do business in the PRC, and other people that are like, there were no lynchings in LA. And yet, we're people and we're humans, and we're a lot more the same than we are different at the end of the day.
Yeah, 100%. You've obviously had an amazing journey, and I know we talked a little bit, but I'd love to know more. Privacy code, where you're kind of currently at. We have some VCs even listening here.
Hey, VCs, get your checkbooks out, kids. Get your checkbooks out. Checkity check.
No, I love it. But yeah, I just love to know more about privacy code and kind of, where are you looking to take things there?
Yeah. So I should self-promote more. That probably tells you why my journey's been slower than it should be. We are pre-seed. We are post-customer. We have a platform that works. We basically are an AI-driven engine. You can upload your written documents, whether that's a privacy impact assessment, RFP, or a policy, and it'll read onto a captive library in 3 different subject matters. One is data quality and governance, mostly governed by the DAMA type schedule, standards. Privacy, of course, which is my kind of hometown wheelhouse, which is, covers things from secure control frameworks, ISO 27001 and 2, and as well as 27701. Thank you, ISO, for making numerical nonsensical. And that's a girl who loves numbers. And responsible AI and new tech. So how you actually set up, like we set up a program when I was at McAfee Intel to do responsible AI review, but we called it responsible new tech. And the gal that was working with us 10 years ago is still running the program, Denise Chenet. Go Denise. It has, the topics change and the complexity changes, but gathering the provenance of your algorithms and understanding the outputs, understanding how are you planning to detect bias, how often are you detecting bias, all this stuff. These are knowable things, and some of them are still in draft from a legislative perspective, and some of them are quite well known, so the model cards, et cetera. And so we break down all of these tasks into processes and technology, and we create programs so that you can basically walk the walk. So like you said before, it's like some people do checklists. I don't really do that, but it's not just me or my team. You can't have a team big enough to be the security team or the privacy team. And you can't just train and say, security is everybody's job. You have to say, if you're a UX person, do not pre-fill in this checkbox. So we are very specific on, what to do, how to do it, what type of person gets assigned it, and then we create proof. So it's an AI on the front end to use LLMs to read in for requirements. We are the console so that you informationally know where you're going cross-functionally. And once your CPO leaves, you're not left with like a sucking sound of, oh God, she left us some spreadsheets, but I don't have all those relationships already nailed. You actually have a working system. And then we use AI on the back end to say, each task is tied back to these standards. What actually is working in the wild? What's thematically sort of on trend? What could you do a little more to recommend? And so it's called privacy code because we really want to break the spine and just become the code that's like a code of conduct, legal code, as well as software and hardware.
That's very, very cool. Definitely people check it out. And, we kind of talked in the beginning, based on when you got started, and no doubt, I'm sure you have many, many stories of having to break through a whole variety of walls, firewalls and other ones, and I think it's obviously really, really cool, the things that you've done. But, I think one of the reasons that we like kind of sharing these sort of stories and focusing on these things from a podcast is, I think, as you kind of mentioned in the beginning, like the ability to pay it forward for folks that are getting started to be able to be there. And we try to have kind of hopefully an exponential effect here in kind of sharing those stories. But, I kind of had asked you, anybody that was kind of the inspiration and looking up to you. And obviously you referenced your parents as a great example of that. But there's a good chance there's somebody right now that's maybe listening that is going to be curious and maybe find this as their own career. Any advice to somebody that, might be curious to kind of get into this area of security, this area of privacy in this field, and kind of how they might begin to even go about that beyond just the necessity of just be curious, which I think we all agree. But this is a great time to get in. So, of the hundreds of young privacy tech startups, I'm the only one that's founded by a chief privacy officer. That needs to stop. That's madness. I mean, of course, I'm biased. And if you're a VC, you should write me a checkity check because we are going places. But I'm not going to build everything. So we're going to have the moral equivalent of firewalls and pen testers. We're going to have lists for malware lists. We're going to have scanners that actually work because we've done the work to figure out what a pattern of privacy demonization is for proportionality. That work has not been done. And then the other thing I think it's most important is we need buyers. So I think the majority of, on the sales side, people will ask me about their current either tool set or lack thereof and say, can you fix this? And I'm like, I would like to refer you to my services partners. But fixing other vendors' crap is not really what new companies do. However, the way that you fix that is be a buyer with a capital B. If anyone thinks that Scott McNeely was like, oh my God, Michelle, you were so right, dude. Like when I said there's no privacy, get over it, I was wrong, dude. Hit the budget. No, he gave me nothing but absolute resistance. However, I came with a business plan. And I came again, and I came again, and I came again. And then he gave me a job and no budget. And then I came again, and I came again, and I came again. And he gave me a title, and he gave me a budget, and he gave me a team. No one's going to hand this to you. Yep. It's valuable. It's scary. You'll spend a lot of time saying things that people do not understand. Keep coming. Come, and ask all the questions that you think are stupid, because a lot of the stuff that we built as the first line sucks. It sucks. I had wood and I was whittling like a dum-dum. You guys have blueprints, you have architecture, you have graduate classes, you have mentors, you have budget, you have venture people who say that they want to invest in privacy. I'd like to meet those people. But you're never just going to sit on your butt and just go, oh my God, I'm going to be a C-suite executive and make $1 million a year and do no work. No, It's hard. You have that C in front of your title because you have to use it as a shield, as an umbrella, as a bucket to put your pee in.
You got to just keep going.
Got to grind. I couldn't agree more. Well, Michelle, it's fantastic having you today. I really, really appreciate you spending the time and sharing your stories. And I feel like there's plenty more, so we might have to do a part 2 at some point, but really appreciate having you on.
Thank you. I love the podcast and keep it going. I love all these stories. And, I'm all about the stories we tell to each other about each other. So thank you, Marc. This is really a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Take care.